Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host, Michael, and this episode is Q&A number 115. Before we get into today's Q&A, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration. You can find Precision Hydration on precisionhydration.com. They make electrolyte supplements that you can match to your individual sweat sodium concentration levels. So if you are somebody who loses a lot of sodium, then you get a stronger electrolyte supplement. And if you lose less, then you get a less strong supplement. And this becomes very easy when you get a free hydration plan. So that's a simple quiz, 10 questions that you will answer on precisionhydration.com. And that will give you a good validated ballpark estimate for how much sodium you lose in your sweat. Also, make sure that you check out their blog. They always have good articles about all sorts of things around endurance sports coming up there. So, for example, a couple of recent ones that were really interesting were: do you sweat when you swim? What happens when you drink too much before a race? And how to use indoor training to prepare for the heat of racing. Check that out, and if you're interested in buying Precision Hydration's electrolyte supplements, then use the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15 to get 15% off your order. And thank you to Roka that you can find on roka.com. Roka produce products of exceptional quality and with a ton of innovations into them. You have things like the arms technology in their wetsuits and tri-suits, the exoskeleton of the Maverick X2 wetsuit, the great lift and buoyancy profile of the Maverick lineup in general, but also in particular the Maverick MX, the max buoyancy wetsuit. In terms of their eyewear, sunglasses and prescription glasses, you have all the ultra lightweight glasses with adjustable titanium cores so you can match them to your face profile, Geeko anti-slip technology, and of course really advanced optics and coatings designed for performance even in extreme conditions. You can get 20% off your Roka order by getting a discount code on roka.com/TTS. Now let's get into today's Q&A, where I have a special guest in Michael Rosenblatt. So you may have heard him on the podcast before. We have done 2 episodes. I'll link to both in the episode description. One of them was on interval training. The other was on polarized training versus threshold training. And in this Q&A, we will discuss interval training. And you, the listeners, have sent in questions about interval training that we'll get to. We will also, before getting into the actual questions, discuss a study that Michael is recruiting for. And this is a remote study, so a training study where you can just do the training prescription on your own smart trainer at home. So yeah, just listen to the details there. And if you're interested, the details for more details and how to sign up is also included in the link in the episode description in your podcast app. All right, hope that you enjoy this Q&A with Michael Rosenblatt. So I'm back with Michael Rosenblatt on the Triathlon Show. And Michael, you've been on the podcast before, so you kind of know how it works, and we won't need to do a long introduction. But one thing that we do want to talk about is a study that you're currently recruiting for. So can you tell us a bit more about that? Because it's a remote study, so people all over the world can participate. Let us know what it's about and who might be interested in participating.
Yeah, for sure. So we're looking for cyclists to take part in, probably the first study of its kind. It's an international training study on interval training. And we're using a software platform called Trainer Road to help with our data collection. And we're collaborating with many sports science researchers, university and cycling clubs around the world. And the primary objective is to determine the effect of different interval work bout durations on time trial performance. And the study, it's a 6-week training intervention. There's some baseline testing for a couple of weeks and then a follow-up week of testing. And the great thing is that, given our current situation, participants will be able to perform all their testing and training sessions at the convenience of their own home with their smart trainer. Yeah.
And who can participate? You said cyclists. Can you give a bit more details? And of course, we don't have to have the full inclusion and exclusion criteria list here, but I guess we will have the link as well in the episode description. But where should people go to find out more?
For sure. So we're looking to recruit participants or individuals between the ages of 18 and 45 years. And you have to have already been cycling for relatively consistently for the last 6 months. I think we're looking at for individuals between anywhere from active athlete up to elites. And yes, we're also looking for multi-sport athletes if they're interested. But primarily during this training period, participants will only be able to take part in just the cycling aspects to maintain consistency among all the participants.
All right. And where do people go to find out more and potentially sign up if they want to do that?
Yeah, so there's a link on my website. My website is evidence-based-coaching.ca, and under the research tab, there'll be a spot where you can click on the training study. So it'll provide some information, some background of really kind of what you'd be getting into, what would be required of you, and some basic information. And there's also at the bottom, before you'd actually go through the registration process, there's also an FAQ page that I posted, so that if there's some additional questions, just to ensure, is this study right for you? And any other questions that we've been getting along the way. So people can register through that website. And I think there's been some postings either through Twitter and I think even through Trainer Road's website and their forums. There's been some people posting about the study. So there's some you can access it through there too, but primarily through the link through evidence-based-coaching.ca.
Yeah, and I'll have a direct link in the episode description here for the podcast as well. What is the benefit for somebody of participating in a study like this?
So I think there's a lot of different benefits, and really what we're trying to do is figure out which mode of interval training might be the most optimal, if there is. I mean, it's interesting because there may not be a difference between those modes, which is still a good result, I'd say. But in terms of the benefits for the individuals who'd be participating, they'll not only will they get some good information result from the testing, but they'll kind of go through a training process that, I can't say it's going to be guaranteed to improve fitness, but generally speaking, when we do an interval training program, we will likely see an improvement in performance. But again, I can't necessarily say that would be the case for ethical purposes. But it'll kind of, I think there'll be some additional benefits, not just in terms of fitness, but in terms of motivation over the winter period. So you get to take part in the study and contribute to science. I think I've seen some joking comments now that people get to give their body to science, or some funny things like that. But overall, it should kind of help with training over the winter and help promote, help improve the field of sports science, and specifically in cycling, for us to all find better ways to train.
And final question, can you elaborate a bit on what types of intervals you are comparing?
So I can't get into too much detail specifically around the exact intervals, because we're hoping to maintain some blinding so that there's a decrease in the bias of the interventions themselves. But basically, we're comparing high intensity interval or different high intensity interval training programs. And participants will perform these sessions a couple of times a week over that 6-week period.
Yep. So harder than FTP, folks. That's what's waiting. All right, let's get into some questions around intervals that listeners have sent in on email and social media and so on. And let me see here. Well, one question that I want to ask about is work-to-rest ratio. So can you talk a little bit about whether there, according to research or just coaching practice, in your opinion, is something such as an optimal work-to-rest ratio, and how different intensities even might impact what the optimal work-to-rest ratio is?
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is a big area of research in interval training. And when we consider that work to rest ratio, we should look at whether we're considering it in sprint interval training or high intensity interval training. But I've recently, and you and I have spoken a little bit about a study that's currently in review. It's a large meta regression, and basically the results of the meta regression is showing that the rest duration may not be as important as we had once thought, at least with regards to improving time trial performance. So whether we have long duration or short duration rest, we're likely to see similar improvements in time trial performance.
Yeah, and that's a really important takeaway in my opinion, because maybe you can just do a little bit better work in the intervals if you give yourself a little bit more rest, and that might be what benefits you more at the end of the day, rather than just cutting the rest very short. And one comment on the meta regression there and the importance or the influence of different parameters on time trial performance. That is, for listeners' knowledge, the best way that you can really assess whether training protocol is effective compared to VO2 max, because an improvement in VO2 max doesn't necessarily mean an improvement in performance, but here performance was assessed directly. Mm-hmm. So the next question is one that is quite common as well. What is a driver of adaptation of high intensity intervals? Is it spending a long time at a high VO2, a high oxygen uptake, or is it more so about the time that you spend at a certain pace or power, irrespective of VO2, or is it something else entirely in terms of the physiology behind it, not necessarily the parameters that you've been looking at in the meta regression?
Mm-hmm. So that's certainly a good question, and it's there's a lot of factors to consider regarding the programming and what's actually happening. I'd say the two camps would be either consider exercising at a high total oxygen consumption. So during that interval bout, to try to exercise as close to your VO2 max as you can. And so that would be looking at a physiological response, whereas the other way of looking at it would be, is it just the fact that we're doing work, and to try to maximize the amount of time we're spending doing work at a high intensity.
And do you have any thoughts on that? Which camp is right?
So and hopefully the study that we're recruiting for might give us some insight into it, even though we're not collecting physiological measures. But right now it's looking like longer duration intervals that are probably between 5 and 6 minutes, give or take a minute, hard to say exactly, might be the most beneficial. And I think that might be because of being able to spend a large time at high oxygen consumption, but also stressing the cardiac, basically your heart, for a longer duration to allow for central adaptations. Though there is some conflicting evidence here from Bent Ronestad, who does these kind of 30-15 protocols. And so it's something that I'm still looking into a little bit, and it's a very interesting results that we've seen from some of his works, where we're seeing that even these shorter intervals can elicit the same type of adaptations. But even though that's the case, they're still exercising at quite a high intensity for a long period of time.
Yeah. And on a related note, some people are asking about whether to start your intervals really hard or really fast if you're running or swimming, to raise oxygen uptake quickly and then just kind of hold on for the remainder of the interval. That's something that has been investigated a little bit, I think. What's your opinion on that sort of protocol?
Yeah, no, I've certainly looked into this quite a bit, and there are a lot of acute studies that see that not only do we get to peak oxygen levels at a much quicker rate, but then the time to exhaustion is much longer by doing these kind of fast start or decreasing workload type of protocols. One thing that I would have liked to test as well, and hopefully when we can all get back into the lab, is to do a training study where we actually see, is there a difference between these kind of fast start protocols and a normal protocol on time trial performance? And that would basically tell us, well, if we do these regular starts, it takes a little bit longer to get to high levels of O2 as opposed to the fast start. And it might provide some more insight into, well, does oxygen really matter? Or is it just the fact that we're exercising and just the mechanical work itself is what's important?
So we don't quite, the jury is still out on that, whether it's really effective.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a new area of work. I mean, it's been around for a few years now, but it's just an emerging area, and it's certainly challenging to conduct training studies. And so I think it makes sense why we don't know as much yet on the topic.
All right, I'm getting a bit more organized with my list of questions here, so I can actually start to say the names of the people that have been asking them. So this one is from Everett in Portland, who asks about how varying one's cadence can impact the adaptation during high-intensity interval training. Are there benefits or drawbacks to doing them significantly lower or higher than your preferred cadence, for example?
Yeah, so that's certainly a great question. And my research primarily focuses around manipulating the programming of the interval training itself. So we look at basically those protocols as opposed to the individual factors or the choice to alter cadence. However, I certainly have read quite a bit of research on manipulating cadence. And actually, I even read one study yesterday. It's a little bit of an older study from 2012 that shows that lower cadence may be beneficial for improving uphill type time trials, whereas faster cadence may be more beneficial for flat type of time trials. So we do see improvements in some physiological measures for different reasons, but it looks like there might be specific adaptations depending on the type of event that you're doing. And I'd say that kind of coincides with what actually happens. You tend to slow your cadence down a little bit when you're going uphill anyways.
Yeah. And next question is from Jack in Canada, who asks, when prescribing intervals at a certain power, like for example, a percentage of your watt max or your MAP, does the type of athlete have a big influence? For example, if you have a more fast twitch dominant athlete versus a more slow twitch dominant athlete in how you prescribe the actual interval session, or should prescribe it, I should say.
Yeah, and so that's certainly a good question, and it'd be hard for us to tell because most of the time when we're working with our athletes, we wouldn't know where the predominance of their muscle fiber types are. However, we would know. I mean, if somebody's going to be working on an endurance sport or wants to compete or participate in endurance sport, that likely we tend to go to the types of sports that we're more genetically capable of. So probably we'd be more likely, or we'd more likely have more slow twitch as opposed to fast twitch. But I haven't really looked too much into the influence of looking at, for instance, sprint interval training versus high intensity interval training on fiber type specific adaptations. And that would go to the idea of, do we train our strengths or do we train our weaknesses? I think it doesn't matter. From some of the results from my meta regression, that we're still seeing that high intensity interval training, which is performed at a lower intensity than sprint interval training, leads to greater improvements in time trial performance, depending on the way the protocol is set up. But generally speaking, that's what we see.
Jack also asks why a research doesn't usually measure the impact of a training intervention on the anaerobic or glycolytic energy systems. It's usually always VO2 max or performance measure or both, but rarely glycolytic. But potentially improvements in the glycolytic capacity could have an influence on, for example, a performance test or performance simulation. So why isn't that measured more often?
No, that's definitely a great question, and it's something that I had to consider when I was putting together some of my previous work. And the primary reason is because it's actually more challenging to measure anaerobic work during an interval as opposed to the aerobic work. So we can measure the oxygen that somebody's utilizing, but one way that we might measure the anaerobic work potentially could be by considering the plasma lactate levels or venous lactate levels. The issue is that they're just not as reliable, and there's some literature that suggests that using these anaerobic or lactate type measurements might not help. But what we can do is, if we measure oxygen uptake kinetics and we consider how much oxygen somebody's used, we can actually model the interval and determine based on how much energy was used aerobically, and then we can calculate how much total energy was used in the interval. We can actually determine within some error how much anaerobic work was done. The only issue here is now when we're modeling aerobic work, the challenging part could be, well, how much aerobic work was done through the use of fatty acids versus carbohydrates. So that could certainly influence the results.
Yeah, but I would concur with Jack there that it would be really interesting to see for example, in studies where you have, let's say, a 10-mile time trial as the performance outcome that you're measuring before and after the study, to actually measure the O2 throughout that performance test, pre and post, and then model the anaerobic contribution to that, so you can actually see whether the effect of the intervention then came from predominantly aerobic improvements or potentially glycolytic improvements, or a combination of both.
Yeah, and actually, I spoke with Stephen Seiler last week, and I don't know how much I can speak to some of his work yet, because I don't know how much of it's public, but I know that he is looking at doing some of this type of stuff, and so it kind of gives us an idea of where some of that anaerobic contribution can go. But again, I don't know too much about how much of that information is available, but I do know that it certainly is something to consider, especially when you go above critical power, to see how much of that of your anaerobic work capacity or your W prime is still left, and how much, basically how many times can you go into the hole while racing.
Yeah. Because a lot of listeners of this podcast, for example, are interested in things like half and full Ironman racing, and then it's all well and good doing an interval training and then improving your 20-minute power. But if it actually turns out that a lot of the improvement came from anaerobic improvements, then it's not so useful for your race performance at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. But let's go to the next topic. And a lot of listeners have a similar question here, but this is from Gesine in Germany, who writes that the instruction in interval workouts tends to be about consistency. So the last set should be similarly paced to the first. You should be able to hold a power or pace throughout the set. Gesine's confusion is that on the last set, my confusion is, on the last set I will be more tired, and to achieve the same pace I will need to work harder. So is that what you're supposed to be doing, or should all reps be at the same perceived intensity, with the understanding that they will get slower after each interval?
So a very, very good question. And there's kind of two ways to approach that. So the first thing to talk about is, are you exercising in the appropriate intensity domain? And what my research is showing, and I'm definitely happy to chat about it a little bit, is that if you're performing high intensity interval and exercise, and you're in that severe intensity domain, which is basically above your critical power but below your VO2 max, and you're in that domain, the speed or power that you're at probably doesn't matter. Now, this certainly would conflict with a lot of other people's beliefs, and there is some conflicting. It does conflict with some research, but the most important thing is that you're within that domain. The other thing that I would say is, because in addition to being an exercise physiologist, I'm also a physiotherapist. And what I'd always say to my athletes is, as soon as you feel like you can't generally maintain the intensity and your biomechanics are kind of going out the window, that's a time to stop, because that's when you're more likely to get hurt. And so there's a difference between, well, I'm a little bit tired, but I can still push it, versus, well, I'm done. And when or if that happens, aside from, you're just not going to get the types of benefits that you'd want physiologically, but you're also more likely to get injured. So, I guess the quick answer for that is, it doesn't exactly matter. You want to make sure you're pretty much exercising roughly at that in the domain that you want to be at.
Yeah, and I think that as an athlete gains more experience, they usually tend to be better and better able to pace the intervals fairly evenly. And if you fade a bit in the last intervals, I don't think it matters. And if you manage to go a bit harder in the last few intervals, that can be great psychologically and also from just the perspective of pacing training, so learning how to pace yourself. But I usually think that, like, if you go out and do a workout and you're not massively like changing the pace or the power from interval to interval, then you're hitting them and you're pretty darn tired after your workout, then you're doing a good job and you're getting the work done that is required, just from a coaching perspective as well.
Yeah.
And then a couple of listeners are asking similar questions to this one. I'm reading the one that Mickey from the United Arab Emirates sent in, which is, having completed blocks of high-intensity intervals, can the adaptation benefits be retained by sprinkling quote-unquote reminder sessions in subsequent training blocks, which might have a different intensity focus, for example, sub-maximal or sub-threshold work?
So I guess the way I interpret that is just basically by, we've done some high intensity interval training, and then if we were doing a different block, maybe if we do the odd session of high intensity interval training.
Yep.
So that's certainly a good question. And there's a lot of research that shows if we do decrease our training load, but we still have some high intensity interval training or even sprint interval training, that we will maintain performance.
Let's assume the training load doesn't decrease because they keep doing training, but a different type of training, maybe more threshold training.
Okay. So it's a tough question. I don't think I have a direct answer to that. But what I can say is that we do see when we change the type of training, generally speaking, you will alter your fitness. I haven't actually seen any studies or have even looked into if kind of adding in the odd session will help maintain or even improve fitness. But what I can say is the total volume or number, I should say, the total number of sessions of high intensity interval training that you perform does not need to be too high. So you don't need to be doing 3 or 4 sessions per week. So if maybe you do only 1 session a week, would that still maintain your fitness? I could certainly speak to if you do 2, that will, but I haven't seen any studies that only include 1. So I guess it's hard to comment on that one.
I'll comment from my coaching experience and anecdotal experience is that, yes, it does seem to work in my opinion. Again, purely anecdotal, not speaking from research. But what I do in that scenario is to maybe not even a dedicated session to high intensity intervals, but it can be doing a block of, let's say, 10 times 1 minute high intensity intervals before the start of a session that might have its main focus threshold work or tempo work, and doing that once per week or so seems to maintain a lot. Or at least then once you do another block of high intensity intervals, you do 1 or 2 sessions and boom, you're back to where you ended, and then you can quickly start to progress even further. So I do see that sort of model with switching the focus to another block, adding a little bit of maintenance work or reminder work, as Mickey called it, seems to work pretty well in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then there are quite a few questions on this theme. This one is from Owen, who writes, within some interval prescriptions, we can see things like do sets of 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off until you can't do anymore or can't hold the pace or power. So basically, until failure type of intervals. What do you think of this sort of prescription compared to a predefined number of repetitions? For example, 2 sets of 10 minutes of 30-30s or 3 sets of 10 minutes of 30-30s?
So yeah, that's certainly a good question. And I don't think it matters. I think what's most important is that you're putting out an effort, and once you go above maybe 4 repetitions, doing many more, you might not necessarily see additional benefits. And in fact, there might be some conflicting literature on that. But again, that meta-regression that I submitted, and I'm excited to get this out so I can talk about it a little bit more. shows that it might not be as important for how many repetitions or how long you're exercising in terms of the total volume. So I don't think it would actually matter if you're going till exhaustion or you just set a certain amount of work within a certain range.
Yeah. And in this example, the 30-30s, what might you say, this might be as a practitioner, what would you say could be potentially the minimal effective dose for an intermediate athlete? So somebody who's an athlete, but they're not elite, they're not,
No, good question. And if I was to prescribe something like 30-30s or maybe even 30-15s, what I would do is I'd have the athlete or the individual exercise for about 8 to 12 total minutes, including the rest, something like that, and maybe do 3 to 4 sets like that. And I think possibly at best perceived effort, which makes it the most realistic for an athlete when they're actually training. So, so probably if we're to say, maybe 4 to 6 minutes of actual work, but if you're, when we're doing these things like 30-15s or 30-30s, your whole body, basically the acute response is quite substantial. So, you're putting quite a large physiological stress on the body. So, I'd say do something like that for about 8 to 12 minutes and just do it like that one whole set of those would be like 1 rep of an interval, and maybe do 4 sets of those.
Yeah. So when you at the beginning said it doesn't matter, that's just to clarify, it doesn't necessarily matter in terms of the benefits from doing things to failure compared to doing 3 or 4 sets as you now describes, but where it can matter is in terms of the cost and the toll that workout takes on you. So that's where maybe thinking about things from a minimal effective dose perspective can be beneficial, and maybe not do too many of those until failure exercises, although they do have their place maybe sometimes in that they can be really beneficial psychologically, and there can be other reasons to do them as well. But from your data, it seems that we could maybe get away with just doing those 3 to 4 sets of 30-15s or 30-30s.
Yeah, and interestingly, it's I think the goal is to find what's the least amount of work we can do to get the most amount of adaptation. And so that's certainly what we want to do to limit fatigue. But as you did say, and I certainly do this personally, I think probably when I'm doing my running intervals, my last interval, I'm just giving her. And does that mean that the intensity needs to be that high for me to get the adaptations, or at least the physiological adaptations? Maybe not. But I've certainly done some triathlon racing at a recreational level, and knowing how to push to get to that finish line is pretty important.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. That's a real skill that is owned in training week after week after week. I actually just now recall my interview with Malcolm Brown, who coached the Brownlee brothers for a long, long time, including double Olympic gold medalist Alistair Brownlee. And one of the key things he said about their ability to suffer and sort of mental fortitude when it comes to pushing themselves is just that's a skill that they've owned since they were 8 years old, and week in, week out doing that sort of work. So the next question is from Heiko, who asks, can you do high intensity interval sessions with more than one, or can you do interval sessions, I should say, with more than one type of intervals where you train different metabolic systems in one session?
Definitely a great question. And I know that, especially when I think about track coaches, you see that very often where, you might do some strides, or you might do some longer intervals mixed with shorter intervals. And I haven't, I don't think I've seen any studies or any science that's actually, I should correct myself. I certainly have seen some that uses a combination of the two. But it's hard to say, well, what physiological adaptations are we getting? And so most of the time we split them apart.
With the two, you mean sprint interval training and high intensity interval training?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's correct. So basically to do, would we do, 20-second all out efforts and mix that up with 4-minute efforts? And as a coach, I mean, I can certainly speak anecdotally on this. As a coach, I thought, well, I know that we get benefits from doing both, but I also know we have a limited amount of sessions that we can do per week. So if we kind of combine the two into one session, you're certainly going to get stress the systems equal or as a, based on the work that you're doing, you'll stress them appropriately. The next question is, if we were to stress the system, which physiological or acute response is going to dominate to then say, let's produce an adaptation. So even though there's these, maybe there's more lactate or we're causing, a greater recruitment of fast twitch muscle fibers, if we want to, for instance, increase how much mitochondria we have, well, is one going to lead to more gene expression of basically the proteins required to make mitochondria? It's really hard to say because we can have all the stimulus, but then what's actually down the chain actually going to lead to longer term adaptation. So good question. I don't think we know enough about this yet. Or at least I know for sure I don't.
Yeah, I'll just add that I have started experimenting with this a little bit. An example would be kind of similar to the maintenance training that we talked about a bit earlier, where I might have an athlete do 4x15-second sprint intervals as part of, like, after their easy warm-up and before a main session of, for example, tempo training. So that is very different. So not combining sit and HIIT, but sit and something else. Or it could even be, in the case of those maintenance sessions, it could be HIIT and something else. But again, yeah, with this, I definitely don't have enough anecdotal evidence even to speak with any certainty about whether I think it works or not. But it's something I've started experimenting with to get a little bit of the benefits that you can get from high intensity sessions, even when other aspects of training are the main focus of a particular athlete.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great question, though.
Yeah. And I think we'll take a break here and come back in 2 weeks' time. So with more questions. So thank you, Michael, so far, and we'll continue answering listener questions in 2 weeks.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you.
I hope that you enjoyed this special Q&A with an expert guest in Michael Rosenblatt. If you like this format with expert guests for particular topics of Q&As, then do let me know. I always appreciate hearing your feedback. We will have part 2 of this Q&A in 2 weeks' time, and then we will discuss things like interval training for older athletes, how to combine interval training in swimming, biking, and running. We will discuss interval progressions and over-under intervals and limiting factors, whether they might be muscular or cardiovascular, and many other things, so don't miss that. And as I said at the beginning of this podcast, in the episode description in your podcast app, there is a link for more information about joining the study that Michael is conducting and recruiting for currently. I hope that if you're interested, you go and have a look and sign up if it seems appropriate for you. Also, if you are interested in coaching services, training camps, or training plans that we offer at scientifictriathlon.com, then go there to the website and you can learn more about those products and services. If you are serious about improvements, or even if you just want help implementing all of the concepts you hear and learn about on these podcasts, but actually putting that into practice, then I would strongly recommend considering getting some sort of help with that, whether that's just a training plan or full-on individual coaching. We have all these different options to suit the needs of most about anybody. Finally, a big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Go and get a free hydration plan and get 15% off your order with the promo code THATTriathlonshow15. And thank you to Roka, that you can find on roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, high-performance eyewear, and prescription glasses and sunglasses, and get 20% off your order with the promo code that you can find on roka.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.